Actually, Rob, I'm reminded. Do you want to hear a joke?
Yeah. Oh, God.
You ready?
No, I don't think
so. So what do people from Boston say to their drunk friends when they try to drive home?
I don't know.
Put the khakis down.
Khakis. Okay. I'm Rob.
And I'm Artie. And welcome to Trade Splaining, a podcast that tries to make sense of international trade, business, and expat life without putting you to sleep. Rob, wake up.
In episode 79, we'll talk about decarbonizing shipping, which is weirdly important. Looking for a better way to measure prosperity. EU-UK trade agreement that's just been signed. Maybe Brexit's not a thing anymore?
Who?
And of course, Switzerland's no brochure on what to do in case of war. And that's been since 1602. That has not been updated.
Thanks for that.
And later on, we'll talk to Eva Bille of the European Environment Bureau, who gives us perspective on why circular is important despite all the recent nonsense. And her kebab preferences based on her, and I put this in air quotes, frequent trips to Geneva. And we'll throw in a few points on listener feedback and sneak in a news roundup and a few jokes.
So let's get into it before I throw in some inappropriate Rob is old joke.
Eat a burger. What is
Well, everyone, welcome to episode number 79. That would be, wait for it now, the atomic number of gold, symbol AU.
Can you use that in watches?
The name is the Anglo-Saxon word for the metal, and the symbol comes from the Latin aurum. In its pure form, it's a bright, slightly orange-yellow, dense, soft, malleable, and ductile metal. Chemically, gold is a transition metal, or a group 11 element, our favorite kind, and also one of the noble metals. I don't know who came up with that, but it's one of the noble ones. It's also being the second lowest in the reactivity series, whatever that means. It's solid under standard conditions, and it's used in electronics, dentistry, medicine, and even space tech, mainly thanks to its conductivity and resistance to corrosion.
I like that smile. I see those gold teeth.
It's also used in watches. Did you know that, Rob?
Yeah, I'm just going to get to that.
The 79th Academy Awards were held in 2007, hosted by Ellen DeGeneres, for those of you who care. Also back when people cared. In Japanese culture, numbers like 7 are considered lucky, but 9 is often associated with suffering. So 79 is a bit of a mixed bag there. You'll be happy to know that according to recent estimates, there are estimated 79 million camels in the world. Not sure who needed to know that, but there you go.
Where are, like a lot of them are in Pakistan. It's true. And there's great camel cheese and milk. It's got a very high fat content, and it's really good for you.
Are you also sponsored by the camel industry?
By Pakistan, camel milk. Thank you, everybody.
In 1979, arguably the weirdest Bond film ever, Moonraker, came out, filled with lasers, zero gravity, and Roger Moore, probably most people's least favorite Bond, in a spacesuit with a martini.
And I believe he had sexual relations in a space capsule.
As one does. The cult classic The Warriors was also released in 1979. It proves that baseball bats, vests, and face paint can be fashion statements. I can attest to this because I just came back from New York, and maybe I'm getting older or it's just the cultural clash now that I've been in Switzerland too long, but the fashion attire takes getting used to.
Warriors, come on and play.
You forgot the...
I don't have 3 beer bottles, but yeah.
As always, I have to mention, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast to make sure you catch our future episodes. It only takes a few minutes. We know you've got the time. Also, make sure you share it with a friend or a stranger. 2 minutes can change our lives, so just please leave a review. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, so subscribe to all of them. And as I said, leave that review. First up, Rob, now that we got the hard stuff out of the way, I wanted to start off with some listener feedback. It's been a few weeks since we had the last episode. This wasn't technically somebody writing us in. That'll be the next one I touch on. But this one I thought was nice. We got a comment on LinkedIn from one of our longtime listeners who told us that basically he loved the last episode. Running around Beijing, listening to Trade Splaining made him feel like he was back in Geneva.
We'll call him Eric.
Yeah. So thank you, Eric. Wink. An actual listener feedback. Listeners may have remembered that we talked about listener Ron writing us in. So Ron actually wrote us back to thank us for the shout out on the podcast, but to confirm that he did not mean to write us anonymously. So he made sure to let us know that his name was in fact at the bottom of the email. So Ron from our lips.
Burgundy.
It's Ron Burgundy. Wink, wink. It's actually,
We'll call him Ron Burgundy.
Ron, thanks for keeping us honest. And now that everyone knows who you are. I'm back now. I was recently in New York for a couple of weeks. I thought maybe listeners should know that if I didn't mention it already. So last episode, we had Lars Carlson on. And as I was in New York, I just saw Maersk containers everywhere. There were a few like Hapag and other ones thrown in there, but Maersk was literally everywhere. There were containers on trucks, containers on the boats. I was on the Staten Island ferry. Great tourist attraction if you're ever in New York.
And Lars said, let him know every time Maersk.
And I literally did.
You did. You bombed him.
He actually blocked my number.
So good.
So now I'm back, and just word of caution, don't fly to Newark. I was supposed to fly out of there. I flew in, and then they had some some outages, things like that, but don't fly there. Or JetBlue, but we'll get there in a little bit.
First of all, thank you for the very nice transition. I appreciate that. This is my episode to say, I told you so. We never should have talked about, yes, I'm going to say it, tariffs.
Say it again.
I can't bring myself to say it. We shouldn't have talked about it. It's been a waste of time. I told you, and I want some sort of compensation for all of the hours, all of the ink, all of the bandwidth we've been using to talk about this terrible content.
We call it content, Rob.
And we need to also compensate Michelle for the time that she spent listening to stuff about tariffs.
Yeah, all the bleeps.
All the bleeps as well. So we're not going to talk about this particular trade measure anymore.
How about you go tariff yourself?
That's a good one. That moves definitely.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the What Went Wrong This Week segment. It's a segment where we break down what's happening in the world of trade. First one up, and that is multilateralism is not, in fact, dead. So the shipping industry moves to net zero, kind of. The global shipping sector just made a big climate commitment, again, and the world has an agreement on pandemics, again. So the IMO approved a net zero target for shipping by 2050. And this makes it the first global agreement to decarbonize what is a notoriously hard to abate sector. It includes checkpoints for 2030 and 2040, but also, in fact, does leave room for interpretation. And some say it lacks a bit of enforcement teeth, which is often the case for large global agreements like this. It just comes with the territory. A fuel intensity standard and global emission pricing mechanism is also set to begin in 2027. It's been hailed as historic by some, but some critics are saying that it's more of a lighthouse in the fog than a binding roadmap, whatever that means. And finally, the WHO member states also concluded negotiations to make significant progress on a draft pandemic agreement, which proves that big, broad agreements are possible. Tell us about that, Rob.
So we increasingly talk about the fact we are unable to come to global agreements. We cannot bring together coalitions to deal with global issues, that we're having trouble dialoguing, that we're breaking into parts. But, however, we've addressed two relatively big things. We talked about shipping before, even with Lars, that they're building a bunch of ships now, which may be a little bit better, but there's actually almost no regulation of how polluting they are. And that's quite a significant contribution to global warming. They're using dirty fuel and so on. There's a lot of different elements to it. So good that the industry has moved that way, and that's over a couple of years. We even talked about this before where they really weren't ready to make very significant commitments. So that's a big one. And of course the WHO thing, not about trade, but they've agreed to cooperate in certain ways which are really significant in the next pandemic. Now, whether certain countries were there or not, I don't think is really the issue. There were a lot of countries that have divergent views on many things, including developing countries that have in many cases blocked or made multilateralism difficult. So it's a breath of fresh air. Can we do this? Yes. We need to have a strong enough argument, and we need to somehow bring together forces that see the value in, or the necessity in, working together.
Thanks for that, Rob. Moving on, Sell America also seems to be back, and I'm putting that in quotes.
Wait, I thought it was Buy America.
The headline is
Sell America.
In quotes, air quotes. So from credit downgrades to skepticism on the foreign front, the U.S. is facing a fresh wave of what seem to be reputational and financial headwinds. Moody's, it's been reported up and down that they recently downgraded the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA1, citing specifically surging debt, political gridlock, and this growing fiscal cliff. It's a bit of a symbolic blow, but there's other things like the growing shift away from the U.S. dollar, which we've talked about. Some countries are diversifying into things like gold or yuan, or, if you're me, Bitcoin. And
buy the dip, folks. Make sure you buy that dip. Actually, you should have a coin called the dip.
Ardi coin?
Yeah, exactly. Or the dip.
So even tourism is feeling it. So New York is seeing fewer big spending clientele. So they were expecting lots of tourists, for example, in the month of May and April, and that didn't seem to be the case. I was
think you
just
even
there,
said-
and I
you
can
said-
attest there's still lots of traffic. It's
The New Yorkers are still in cars, that's for
it's
sure.
slightly less, and everyone is dinged up because they're all getting accidents left and right. And what's also most important on this topic now, if we're moving
go
on
ahead.
from New York City traffic, Walmart, retailers like Walmart are doing well domestically, but they are raising prices because of what they say are tariffs. And finally, and this is on a personal note, I don't know if this has anything to do with what we're talking about, but a growing number of wealthy Americans are in fact opening bank accounts in Switzerland as part of this. What are the key tidbits that you saw from there? You hear from them?
I think you're right. So a lot of what the U.S. has benefited from is a kind of confidence game. There's got to be trust in the currency. There's got to be trust that what the U.S. does is predictable. There's got to be trust that the U.S. will remain relatively stable in terms of trade relations and all of this. And yes, the U.S. has a good brand in attracting tourism. All of these things are a little bit interrelated. And we see, even though there's been a truce in the trade chaos, and even though things are settling a little bit in terms of some of the financial aspects, bond market and the dollar, we see a kind of advancing erosion of this. And so the value of it, we will start to see as, if it does, as it erodes. And I think that's something that people don't immediately understand, that all of these things are interrelated. And that has to do with being predictable. That has to do with creating a brand that people want to be attracted to. But we know it's been an erosion since the Iraq War. So it's since the mid-2000s when U.S. brands started to go down. But, you know, when is it actually going to be a kind of critical mass? When's it going to actually flip? That's the question, because that will, we've already talked about. So the big thing could be U.S. borrowing costs going up. The big thing could be dollar as a reserve currency no longer being a thing. Could be Canadians not walking across the border to buy 3 cartons of cigarettes.
I think uncertainty is also a big thing that keeps popping up. So if that were to subside, that might alleviate some of these concerns that globally, I should say. But until that happens, I don't see that. I see it trending one way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it kind of feeds on itself. So even if things stabilize now, they'll be like, can you trust, or what is the stability factor that can be relied upon? The answer is it's less and less. And that's what we talked about a few months ago. We said the U.S. is acting like an emerging market. You make a lot of money, you can lose a lot of money, but it's not necessarily going to be the place you want to put your kids' college fund.
So the important takeaway is buy the dip.
Always. Always.
Moving on.
Get some Artie coin, folks. Thank you
Moving-
very much.
Moving on. The UK and the EU also just signed the post-Brexit trade pact. So they seem to be quietly patching up these trade headaches with a new agreement. And it's important to mention that not everyone's thrilled. So they did agree on streamlining food and agricultural trade, removing most export checks, and smoothing frictions that have plagued supply chains since Brexit. And most listeners will know this, but you have a whole cottage industry that popped up post-Brexit on people who were there, whose whole business became just explaining to businesses within the UK and also to a lesser extent in the mainland EU on what are the rules and procedures that they need to follow to export in and out of across the two borders. The deal also links electricity markets, and it does establish a youth mobility scheme, which was hindering talks up to this point, and it makes cross-border movement easier for young professionals. In a slightly controversial move, so the EU fishing fleets will retain access to UK waters until 2038, and this has sparked lots of backlash from communities and coastal communities in the UK and some Tory MPs. Remember, the British fish were like a happy fish was like one of those sayings a few years back. Ardent listeners will remember. We talked about it at least. And finally, I think while business leaders did welcome this predictability, coming back to that, some argue it does mark a quiet but steady realignment of UK policy back towards Brussels.
Yeah, we've been saying Brexit's still a thing. That's been a theme of the podcast. Now Brexit's maybe no longer a thing, because some of the things, the frictions that were created by Brexit between UK and EU are being slowly, as you say, addressed. And we think probably for the better, right? There should be alignment of requirements. There should be alignment for things like carbon trading schemes. There's not necessarily a reason why these should be different. And the new work that's been required has had a relative high cost on UK, probably much more than Europe. We know that. It's also, though, as we know, feeding populist politics in Britain. So we have a lot of criticism of this agreement, saying that it's a backsliding. So let's see how the British public responds. But the geopolitics have changed since 2016 as well. So the UK has also signed an agreement with the US, But clearly, they need to think about where they stand in terms of the geopolitical landscape. And they didn't get, I wouldn't say, such a stellar agreement with the U.S. We know that. That's well documented. So they're looking about where is the money really printed? What side of the bread is the butter on?
That's really Gen Z, Gen X, excuse me.
This is Gen whatever.
That's
what
that's
side of the bread
joke.
is the butter on?
That's
And you know what side it's on? The EU side.
That's a boomer joke.
And fishing rights is not an existential issue.
A British listener actually texted me and asked, what did the UK get out of the deal with the US? And I sent them back the gif from Willy Wonka. You get nothing, sir?
No, it's not that. You can still sell more Rolls Royces at a lower tariff than you would have otherwise done. That's one of the big things.
Okay. I was being facetious. That person never texted me.
Who can get a Rolls Royce? Do you realize what 25% of a Rolls Royce is? That's a lot of tariff, bro.
It's not enough for a
It's a
person who
lot
can
of
afford
tariff.
a Rolls Royce to care.
It's a lot of tariff when I'm right on the edge of getting a Rolls Royce. I'm just right there. And then suddenly, bang. You know what I mean?
Rolls
You know what I mean?
Royces are not aspirational.
It's like a watch.
Rob.
I've already got something on my wrist that tells time and date, and now you want me to buy something that tells time and date. That's 10 times as expensive.
Yeah, but that's like
and now
saying-
you put 25% on
but
top of
let's
it.
saying I have
can
six
use my current
Lexuses.
watch.
6 Lexuses doesn't mean you can own a Rolls Royce or a whatever.
No, I think you can trade those in.
Some economists are saying that it's time to ditch GDP and find smarter ways to gauge economic health. So we've talked about this in the past on previous episodes, so it's cool that it's come up now. There's a new foreign affairs piece which is arguing that GDP alone doesn't cut it anymore, and it's calling for modern metrics that reflect the country's real financial health, things like net assets and balance sheet strength. It's also suggesting that countries should track both public and private sector liabilities to understand resilience a bit better and avoid the kinds of hidden debt risk that sank previous economic cycles.
So I think this was very timely because we have been thinking, what are accompanying measures? Is GDP the only thing? Remember we talked about Europe behind the GDP race, but are they well behind in quality of life or all the things that matter race? And so this article is really important because it points out again that the national accounts system was set up in the 40s, and this was set up primarily to measure supply. So GDP is about supply. And do we have enough supply to win the war and these kinds of things? And it was also set up to understand a system where most of production takes place in one country. So there's not distributed value chains and so on. So it misses many things. It's very tilted towards manufacturing. It doesn't capture a lot of the things that you mentioned about, what really represents financial health of a country, including, as you say, net assets, balance sheet strength, but also things like natural resources.
And walking to work in less time than it takes.
All those things, yeah. So,
fly across country.
and of course, GDP numbers get adjusted, and the way they're measured gets adjusted. But these are all incremental changes in a system that's outmoded. So I think it would be really interesting to address that because basically the article argues that the policymakers are targeting something that does not really make sense anymore, so that they're pulling levers and using anecdotal data that probably isn't where it needs to be.
But it could be better. But not great, not terrible.
It can be better. Of course it can be much better, but it's going to cost you.
In that case, I don't want it. Eva-Maria Bille is in charge of the European Environmental Bureau activities around circular economy policy. My old job. She's previously spent 10 plus years as an EU policy consultant, also working with major companies and trade associations in the Brussels bubble. Her term, not ours. She's also worked for the UN in Lebanon and spent 4 years also working in China.
She studied economics and graduated with a master's degree specializing in resources development and growth from Tilburg University, probably in Denmark. She's lived in 8 countries around Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East, and besides her native Danish, speaks English, Dutch, French, Mandarin Chinese, not the other kind, and enough German and Levantine Arabic to get around.
So, Eva, thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. Why don't we start off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up working in the trade space, and what is it that EEB does?
Thank you. No, really a pleasure to be here. I don't think I would necessarily say that I work in trade, but a lot of policy work typically includes some sort of trade angle. I ended up working in Brussels by complete chance after living in 8 different countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. My first country was China. I've always been interested in global issues, and I moved to China when I was 19. alone.
The price of this interview just went up.
145.
Actually, no, take what I said the second time, divide that
Double
by 3.
it.
No, I mean, there was, back in the day, it was a relative openness of China, and it seemed like a good idea at the time to learn Mandarin and then go back to Europe and study economics. So I thought that would be a pretty cool combination, but then I eventually decided that would make more sense for me to wrap my head around EU policy and use that to work on global environmental issues. So a bit of a roundabout way, but hey, here I am.
What is it that the EEB does more broadly?
The EEB is the largest network of civil society organizations working on the environment. By large, I mean it has more than 190 members in 41 countries, altogether representing more than 3 million citizens that care about the environment. And that means we have a vision that the next generation should be better off than the current generation, leaving the planet in a better space than it was.
And what is their message to policymakers or to people like us working in trade?
There are many messages to give, but I think the ultimate message is quite simple. We believe in a world where equal, just, peaceful, and democratic societies can prosper with rich biodiversity, safe climate, laws and policies promote health and well-being, and respecting nature. So, yeah, we believe that Europe has a crucial role to play in building this future.
We've all been reading the news these past few months. Has the message you're making become harder considering that there are different factors at play now? Europe has to consider things like defense spending more at the forefront nowadays. Does that make the message you're trying to give tougher?
It makes it harder to make the message land. The message hasn't changed. The EB has existed for more than 50 years, but we've had ups and downs. The previous commission period from 2019 to 24 was a good period for environmental NGOs. It was on the agenda. All topics we work on were on the broader political agenda, and the political message was landing with much more ease. Now, I think we still find cut through, but it is mostly in areas actually like circular economy, or in areas where there is more of an angle or a fit with competitiveness and resilience. Indeed, I don't think we've changed the ambition or the message, but the context has changed, and it certainly takes a different narrative to cut through.
And do you have, I mean, we'll come back to circularity, but just in terms of the overall message, do you have to weigh things like competitiveness and income and GDP against the message, or do you feel like the process will balance it?
It's hard to say what's going to happen. This competitiveness debate is more of a, we've discussed this at length internally, but fundamentally competitiveness in itself doesn't do anything. Striving for competitiveness doesn't really say much. There is actor A and actor B, and they're engaging in an ecosystem where they compete for something, but it doesn't actually give any indication as to what are they competing for or against, who are they, how are they collaborating, what are they doing really. If there's competitiveness in a race to the top, that's very different from some interpretations of competitiveness now that seem more like a race to the lowest labor standards and the lowest price.
Okay, that's actually a really good point. If we substitute competitiveness for something like productivity or cost, do you think there are trade-offs there? For instance, the demand for organic foods goes down because people have lower purchasing power. Consumers are making that choice. Do you have to be sensitive to that sort of thing? Is that a thing you also have to discuss?
We work a lot together with consumer organizations and social organizations, for example, in affordable housing and affordable food. We think it's incredibly important to work together with social partners and to understand the issues that interplay. And when we talk about a just transition, it's about a transition that brings people along. When you talk about concepts like productivity, it depends a little bit, again, in what we're talking about, because it's no secret that we are producing and consuming more than the planet can handle right now. Earth Overshoot Day moves closer to January every year, and there's not a single country that lives within its planetary boundaries or within the resources allocated. So if we just talk about productivity in resource terms, then I think that's a very alarming message that we need to produce more. For what?
More
Yeah,
watches.
that's exactly, more luxury goods. If you're talking to Artie. So everybody's got a different view. But I think that's really interesting. So you're basically challenging And we hear this a lot, challenging things like GDP, the things that we think about as measures of whether we're doing well economically or not.
There's a lot of interesting economic scholars working on the concepts of degrowth, or Kate Raworth and donut economics, of living above social minima but within planetary boundaries. And I think that's really interesting research. If we are serious about long-term competitiveness or a long-term planet, we need to think about planetary boundaries and the resources we can make use of without destroying the Earth for the next generations.
One of the things we ask about a lot is European regulations. People are worried about this. Is it too much? It's a lot of paperwork, compliance. We're not even sure how we're going to, from a trade standpoint, how customs authorities can check if something's sustainable or not sustainable. We had Pauline on who was talking about 21st century customs fraud. How do we know oil's recovered? He's really cool. So just wading into this issue of regulation, is it the right amount? Is it the right amount to get us towards the goal that your members are seeking?
You're asking two questions in one, I feel like. Is it the right amount of legislation, and how's the legislation implemented, and how's compliance? In response to the first question, these regulations were not just one man inventing it and writing it up on a wall and saying, please comply, everyone. The EU process is lengthy, and there's consultation with stakeholders. These texts are an agreement between 27 member states, an elected European Parliament, and a European Commission consisting of 30,000 civil servants working on these policies. They have all the legislations that have been adopted through a long and consultative process with some of the most intense lobbying we've ever seen. Is it too much? I don't think it's nearly enough. If you ask us in all of the things we were asking for, we've achieved maybe half or maybe a third or even less of what we're asking for. We certainly did not achieve everything we thought would come out of the Green Deal, and neither did the Commission. The Commission had to scrap several laws, but everything that's on the table now is the bare minimum and is certainly democratically agreed.
I think most people would agree with all of these points you're making. My question would be, what's the best way to do it? Is the EU or Europe shooting itself in the foot without having global consensus on these types of rules and regulations? What seems to have happened over the last couple of years is there's been an arbitrage with different countries or regional economic blocks where it's, hey, we have no taxes here, there's much less paperwork, and so bring your business here. And whether that's in finance or people constantly talk about the number of European startups. They always mention Spotify and maybe Klarna. How do you square that circle? It seems like Europe is doing this with great intention, but without a global agreement on the best way to do this, how do you get closer to the goals you're talking about?
It is true that our global system is completely interlinked, and it's hard to find a product or a supply chain that is completely local. I think it's not going to be possible for the EU to isolate itself and just make policies and shut everyone out. And I think to the EU's credit, it has changed the sort of way its approach to development cooperation by, first of all, not calling it development cooperation anymore, but calling it international partnerships. When going from DG DevCo to DG INPA, which is a harder to swallow acronym. But I think there's a lot of work also through the Global Gateway to work together with partners around the world and to also consult and make sure that these viewpoints are listened to. What I would like to see is a global system in place where, for example, we have a global plastics treaty. It would be very nice to have a global plastics treaty that curbs not just plastic pollution, but also plastic production. It would be very nice if we can repeat what we had in the Paris Agreement on a resources level. And there's a lot of work going on with UNEA and other bodies, but it would be great if we could globally set resource reduction targets. There are some processes, but I think from a European perspective, we need to start somewhere. The triple planetary crisis did not go away because trade wars happened. It's still an issue, and we still need to deal with that. So I think we need to start somewhere, and hopefully that somewhere is consultative enough that other countries can be part of that process and adopt similar policies that fit their local context.
So I wanted to come back. I wanted to ask what would be your vision for how do you see the world moving towards that, and what could be some of the pivot points or precipitating factors that would move people in that direction?
That's That's a really good question. One good thing now in this new political context is the circular economy is one of those things that have remained high on the agenda, and it is one of those things that it's hard to find anyone, at least in the Brussels bubble, who would disagree with the concept of a circular economy. We talk about strategic autonomy and resilience and access to resources, a secondary market for raw material. Most industries and most actors are quite happy with that concept. I think where we may differ is in what we really define as a circular economy. To us, as appendage to a regular economy that continues its productivity growth into infinity, and then we have a nice little circular economy next to it bringing in extra resources. We see it more as a systemic shift towards an economy that is truly circular, where we make the most out of the resources, where we close the loop. And to me, the best starting point would be, can we agree that we need to reduce the amount of resources that we consume? If we can agree to that, ideally at a global level, we're dreaming here, but if we could agree to set targets on resources, then that will drive action. There are many different avenues being explored in the Circular Economy Act. It's from everything specific waste laws. It's about making a secondary market for raw materials. It's about setting criteria for end of waste. It's about facilitating repair. It's about economic incentives, everything from greening VAT to repair vouchers in certain countries. So there's a lot of enabling instruments around that, but I think the best enabling factor would be if we could just set targets on resource use and guide the economy into another direction.
And make it more expensive, or price that in a way.
I think we need to price in externalities and think about the long term. If we're thinking of the next year, we can extract a lot of things, make more products and destroy them if they don't get sold. But if we are thinking of a long-term future, we need to think about having resources in 20 years or 50 years.
Artie's looking at me because I'm old.
You have kids, Rob.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So I think we need to transition to the scientific part of the podcast. Artie, let me hand that to you. You're the scientist here. I'm the hard-hitting journalist.
What did you learn about your home country while living abroad that you didn't realize before you left?
Wow, that's a really good question. I guess I just realized how tiny Denmark is. I suppose I moved from Denmark to China, which is probably at the extreme. Yeah. Maybe in some ways, but no, I think you learn when you live abroad, you learn a lot about how there are just so many ways of doing things. Growing up in Denmark, a small country, we have all these rankings of happiest country in the world. We found a nice way to live, which is true. It's nice growing up in Denmark, but there are just so many ways to live in China. Even within China, there are so many different ways of building your life. And I think that was a very healthy starting point for me to learn that there are more ways of doing things than in Denmark.
So we've been collecting data over the last few years on a very important question which affects people in Geneva, but a much wider audience. On your frequent visits to Geneva, which kebab would you consider to be the best based on the important circularity considerations you've brought to the table today?
I've only ever been to Geneva once. I hope you will take me to kebab when I next go to Geneva. The only meal I had, I was on Interrail. I thought, this country looks beautiful. And I got off the train and saw the 20 Swiss francs for a little toast with melted cheese in the food truck. I went to France immediately. I prefer kebabs in Beirut, obviously.
Okay, now she's pulling out the big guns. Even though it was invented in Germany. So,
Whoop.
Well, that about wraps up the interview. Eva, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thanks once again for joining us, and hope to get you again soon.
Thank you so much. It's been really great talking to you, and I hope we can... Circularity is one of those things where we need all actors to be on board, so hopefully more people will get on the shift towards the circular economy.
And if they want to learn more about EEB or the work you're doing on circularity, where would listeners go?
They can go to our website, eeb.org, or we're also on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, all of the cool places where the cool kids hang out.
That brings us to our next segment. This is where TS correspondent Michelle talks to us about the vibe shift.
Is it dead yet?
Michelle, as Artie's inarticulately asking, is globalization finally dead?
Maybe, because I'm back with more recession indicators. This week, Enron is back.
No.
Yep, that's right. The CEO of the new and totally not illegal company Enron has showed up on TikTok to explain that he is looking towards the future with new energy.
Okay.
For the future, presumably. First on the list is the Enron Egg, the world's first personal nuclear reactor. Totally useful for stuff.
This is not that 32-minute egg that we had last week. No, this is
No, I don't think that was nuclear.
We're not going to cook
it
this one.
It was good, but it wasn't nuclear. And if you're wondering, yes, the Enron Egg is fake. The TikTok CEO is actually a comedian. Same guy who invented the birds aren't real conspiracy theory back in 2020. The birds are robots that Reagan put on the trees to spy on you.
Okay.
That's the same guy who's doing Enron now.
You mean they aren't?
Aren't. No, turns out that was just 2020. This is all obviously a joke. What the joke is about, though, is not quite clear. In the meantime, the Enron.com store is still selling out routinely, but unfortunately, they don't sell the nuclear reactor eggs yet.
What are they selling?
You have to settle for a sweatshirt.
Cadbury eggs.
Sweatshirt. I would buy that right away.
Cadbury eggs?
Cadbury eggs.
No, that there would be Enron eggs.
Enron eggs, excuse me. And
Cadbury's
they're nuclear.
another brand.
Personal nuclear reactor.
We can settle for a sweatshirt, and everything else is done.
So, folks, that brings us to this week in local news. You wouldn't believe this was true unless you lived in Geneva or really anywhere else. All jokes are local, as Lyndon Johnson once said. So, first of all, I think it's important everybody knows that the Swiss Federation is updating the brochure on what you should do in the time of war. Mm-hmm. So, last edition was put out in 1601, just before John Calvin and Mère Royaume expelled the folks from Savoy with hot soup.
To Annemasse.
Back to their suburbs here. The strategy didn't change when the Germans and other folks were around in the 40s. The strategy was still pretty cool. Now they need an update. And apparently, in addition to hot soup and some sort of a torch, you should take a battery-powered radio and get a backpack, not a suitcase, so your hands can be free when you're running.
I took note of this since I'm Swiss. I'll probably will be asked to sign up. I'm just wondering, do you think there'll be Wi-Fi?
Yes, exactly.
Or like
Will there be Wi-Fi after?
At least like a hotspot? You think Swisscom will have service there?
Swisscom doesn't have hotspots now.
They don't even. How are we going to melt the cheese? That's what I'm asking.
Do I look resourceful to you? Do you looking at me like I'm MacGyver or something?
So, folks, it is a scary time. Read your brochure. And when the Savoyards tried to climb up your building, we know what to do. Second thing, we have another case, and this is just to our friends here who live in Switzerland who may not be from Switzerland. We have another case of folks who wanted to become Swiss, and this is not a thing that's bad in the principle, but they were living near Zurich, Dutch couple, doesn't matter, they're Dutch, but their application was refused as the local municipality believed they had not made enough Swiss friends. So this is just a reminder, everybody, when it comes time, you put your application in, the paperwork's easy, but are you really Swiss enough? We all know also the lady who had tried to mandate that the cows not wear bells anymore, also didn't get citizenship. So let's keep our heads down. Let's make just enough friends.
Until you get the citizenship.
You need to make friends with Valti, Regula, all those guys.
You just made those names up.
Those are true. Those are true names.
I think, I don't know why we're surprised. One, because all these things happen near Zurich or like in and around Zurich canton. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see that happening. Two, is a Dutch couple. And I mean, I like the Dutch, but the Dutch can be a bit like straightforward. And so maybe they're a bit too straightforward.
That's why they
and
don't
so
have
maybe
any
there's a
friends.
reason. That's what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
I'm just wondering if there's another nationality within this story that you can take a pot shot at.
This lady who didn't like the cowbells was French.
I don't think so. I think she was.
You don't know.
She was also Dutch.
You
Now I
don't know
remember
for
the story.
certain.
So sadly, that kind of proves what you were saying.
Exactly. Thank you.
The last thing that we do need to talk about, and I'm glad you asked, is that as traditionally in Switzerland, sheep are shorn right around mid-May for the Schafkalte, This is when things get a little cold and
Did you
damp
practice that?
for a few days in June. And
I had to read that 3 times. I didn't get that.
and in many sheep farmers, as we know, that's when they take the wool over to the Swiss Wool Company. There's one company. This spring, however, they're not accepting any wool, man. This is a little bit of a crisis because there's a lot of really fuzzy sheep out there, and it's getting damp and cool, as we said. And this company in St. Gallen's not taking any sheep. And frankly, it's requirement they be shorn at least once a year, which sounds like not that many times really a year. So for a lot of these poor farmers, there's going to be a lot of extra wool. So what I'm saying is get out there, support your local farmer, buy some wool.
Make a coat.
Right? Go find
Get
a guy.
into knitting. Figure it
Yeah.
out. I think this is a bad situation.
This is a very worrying...
Here we go.
Well, folks, that about wraps up episode 79, brought to you by I Told You So about tariffs. The Sell America, you thought it was Buy America, now it's Sell America, yes it is. Brexit no longer being a thing, and of course, your local Swiss wool farmer, which you should visit and maybe buy a couple tons. There's a few hundred tons there, so you may just want to grab a ton or two.
How about we call it Buy the Dip on America?
Buy the sheep dip.
No, Buy the Dip on it. Instead of Sell America, we Buy the Dip America.
Buy the dip America. We're going to positivize this. We also want to take the opportunity to thank Eva Bille for helping us keep our eyes on the prize even while there's trade chaos, and for her advice on Swiss fast food, which she gave grudgingly, I would say.
That's right. We also want to thank our executive producer, Michelle Olguin, as well as Armina Sinani for helping and highlight the buy shift, as well as in helping produce this and every TS episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already to make sure you catch our future episodes coming out very soon. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcast. Literally anywhere. Before you say anything, Rob, anywhere. Don't forget to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We do read them all, so please be gentle. And follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, pretty much anywhere. Or email us. This is also a good one. Email us your questions, comments the old-fashioned way at trade.splaining@gmail.com. Once again, that's trade.splaining@gmail.com.
And remember, folks, listen responsibly.
Khakis.
I don't get that. I don't get it.